In 1952, you could stand on the west side of Manhattan and watch the greatest ocean liners ever built slide into port. The Queen Mary, the SS United States, the Andrea Doria. One after another, they glided past the Statue of Liberty and docked along a 4-mile stretch of piers so busy that longshoremen worked around the clock just to keep up. The Port of New York handled 33% of every manufactured good shipped in or out of America. 750 piers and docks, 1,100 warehouses, 35,000 longshoremen earning their living on those wooden planks. This was the engine that built the greatest city on earth. Then something arrived that killed it all. By 1983, those same piers sat rotting in the Hudson River. The longshoremen were gone. The warehouses were abandoned. The ships had vanished. 90% of those 35,000 jobs erased in less than 2 decades. The waterfront that once employed 1 in 10 New Yorkers became a derelict wasteland of barbed wire, broken concrete, and silence. This is the story of how a single metal box destroyed a 300-year-old empire. How one trucking company owner from North Carolina saw what the most powerful union bosses and shipping executives in America refused to see. And how New York City, the city that reinvented itself more times than any other, failed to adapt when it mattered most. This isn't just about old ships and abandoned docks. This is about the cost of ignoring technological revolution, the danger of protecting yesterday's jobs instead of building tomorrow's economy. And what happens when an entire industry believes it's too powerful to fall? Welcome to the silent port of New York, where America's maritime empire was built, dominated, and destroyed. September 12, 1609. Henry Hudson sails a 3-masted carrack called the Half Moon into a harbor so vast, so protected, so perfectly positioned that it will shape the next 4 centuries of American history. The Lenape people have fished these waters for generations. They call their dugout canoes after the tulip tree they're carved from. They have no idea what's coming. The Dutch arrive first. Governor's Island, 1624. Brooklyn, 8 years later. Peter Stuyvesant, the peg-legged Director General of New Netherland, orders construction of the colony's first wharf in 1648. Schreier's Hook Dock rises on the Manhattan bank of the East River, sheltered from winds and ice. It's a modest structure, wooden planks, a place to tie up small boats, but it's the beginning of something that will become unstoppable. Because this harbor isn't just good, it's perfect. Deep water, natural protection, the Hudson River flowing north into the continent's interior. Boston has a harbor. Philadelphia has a harbor. Baltimore has a harbor. None of them have this. For 175 years, New York grows steadily. Wharves multiply along the East River. Merchants get rich, ships come and go, but the city remains one port among many, competing with rivals up and down the Atlantic coast. Then everything changes. October 26, 1825. Governor DeWitt Clinton boards a canal boat called the Seneca Chief in Buffalo, New York. He's about to travel 363 miles east along an artificial waterway that critics called Clinton's Big Ditch. 8 years of construction, $7 million. 83 locks lifting boats over the Appalachian barrier that has blocked westward commerce since the nation's founding. The Erie Canal connects the Great Lakes to the Hudson River. The Hudson River connects to New York Harbor. New York Harbor connects to the Atlantic Ocean. For the first time in history, The American interior has a direct water route to Europe. 10 days later, Clinton reaches New York City. He pours 2 casks of Lake Erie water into the Atlantic. The wedding of the waters, they call it. Pure political theater, and the most consequential ceremony in American commercial history. The numbers tell the story. Shipping costs collapse. $100 per ton by road becomes $10 per ton by canal. 90% reduction. Travel time from Buffalo to New York drops from 3 weeks to 10 days. Grain from Ohio, lumber from Michigan, flour from the Midwest, all of it now flows through one choke point, Manhattan. By 1828, import duties collected at the New York Custom House are funding the entire federal government. By 1850, the city's population has quadrupled. By 1860, 2/3 of all American imports and 1/3 of all exports pass through this harbor. Boston falls behind. Philadelphia falls behind. Baltimore falls behind. New York doesn't just lead. New York dominates. The Erie Canal transforms a colonial trading post into the commercial capital of the Western Hemisphere. The city that controls this funnel controls American commerce. Period. For the next 130 years, no one will seriously challenge that dominance. New York's position seems as permanent as the bedrock beneath Manhattan. But geography alone doesn't move cargo. That requires muscle, human hands, and an army of men willing to work in conditions that would break most people. Dawn, any morning, any pier along the Manhattan waterfront. Hundreds of men gather in a semicircle, breath visible in the cold air, eyes fixed on one man standing above them. The hiring boss. He doesn't speak. He points. You. Work today. You. Work today. You. Go home. This is the shape-up, the daily ritual that determines whether a longshoreman feeds his family or doesn't. No seniority, no schedule, no guarantees. You show up before sunrise. You wait. You hope the boss points at you. If he doesn't, you walk away with nothing. The men who get picked climb aboard ships that have crossed oceans carrying cargo from every corner of the world. Coffee from Brazil, textiles from England, machinery from Germany, bananas from Central America. All of it packed in wooden crates, canvas sacks, barrels, bales. None of it standardized. None of it easy. The work is medieval. A longshoreman descends into the hold of a ship, hooks a cargo net to a crate, signals the winch operator above, watches the load swing upward and outward onto the pier. Then he does it again, and again, and again, for hours, sometimes for days. A single medium-sized freighter requires 100 men working around the clock for an entire week to unload. 7 days of backbreaking labor to empty one ship. The danger is constant. Cargo swings unpredictably, nets break, loads shift, crates tumble. A moment's inattention and a man is crushed, maimed, killed. There are no safety regulations worth mentioning, no protective equipment, no insurance. You get hurt, you stop working. You stop working, you stop eating. By 1880, 95% of New York's longshoremen are Irish or Irish-American. The remaining 5% are Germans, English, Scandinavians. These aren't just statistics, they're territorial markers. The waterfront is carved into ethnic fiefdoms as rigid as any medieval kingdom. Irish work gangs control the piers from Hell's Kitchen down to the Battery. Manhattan's West Side belongs to them. The hiring bosses are Irish. The union officials are Irish. The political connections run straight to Tammany Hall. If you want to work these docks, you better know someone. And that someone better be Irish. The Italians take Brooklyn, Staten Island, the Lower East Side, the Jersey Shore. Same system, different names. Each pier controlled by a specific local. Each local controlled by men, who answer to men, who answer to men, whose names never appear on union rolls. And underneath all of it, corruption. Hiring bosses expect kickbacks for work assignments. Loan sharks circle the shape-up, offering advances against wages that haven't been earned yet at interest rates that guarantee permanent debt. Cargo disappears from holds and reappears for sale in warehouses owned by people who don't ask questions. Union dues flow upward into pockets that have nothing to do with worker welfare. A 1954 government study documents what everyone already knows, but no one will say publicly. Loading cargo onto a conventional ship costs $5.86 per ton, nearly $6 for every ton that crosses the dock. And the biggest part of that cost isn't the ocean voyage. It's not the ship. It's not the fuel. It's the human labor required to move cargo piece by piece, crate by crate, barrel by barrel, from hold to pier, and pier to warehouse. Ships spend more time sitting at dock than sailing the ocean. Goods take longer to load than to cross the Atlantic. The entire system is a choke point made of human muscle, and that choke point employs 35,000 men in the port of New York alone. 35,000 longshoremen, 35,000 families, entire neighborhoods in Red Hook, Hell's Kitchen, Hoboken, Jersey City, built around the certainty that cargo will always need to be handled by human hands, that ships will always need to be loaded the same way the Phoenicians loaded them 3,000 years ago. The work is brutal, the system is corrupt, the danger is constant, but the jobs are there. Generation after generation, fathers bring sons to the shape-up. This is how it's done. This is how it's always been done. This is how it will always be done. The waterfront isn't just an industry. It's a world, a culture, a way of life passed down through blood and sweat and broken bones. And in 1954, Hollywood decides to show America exactly what that world looks like. July 28, 1954. A black and white film premieres in New York City. Elia Kazan directs, Bud Schulberg writes the screenplay, and Marlon Brando delivers a performance that will redefine American cinema. I could have been a contender. I could have been somebody, instead of a bum, which is what I am. On the Waterfront tells the story of Terry Malloy, a washed-up boxer turned longshoreman who watches his corrupt union boss murder a fellow worker for threatening to testify before a crime commission. Terry knows what happened. Terry knows who did it, and Terry has to decide whether to keep his mouth shut or tell the truth and face the consequences. The film wins 8 Academy Awards: Best Picture, Best Actor for Brando, Best Director for Kazan, Best Supporting Actress for Ava Marie Sant in her film debut. Audiences pack theaters across America. In some cities, the crowds become so agitated that police are called to maintain order. People aren't just watching a movie. They're watching their own waterfront reflected back at them. Because every frame is real. Schulberg based his screenplay on a Pulitzer Prize-winning series of articles by Malcolm Johnson, published in the New York Sun in 1948. Crime on the Waterfront, Johnson called it. 24 articles documenting what everyone on the docks already knew. The International Longshoremen's Association wasn't just a union. It was a criminal enterprise. Kazan films on location in Hoboken, New Jersey. He casts real dock workers alongside professional actors. 3 of the toughest characters in the film are played by actual ex-boxers who once fought Joe Louis for the heavyweight title. Tony Galento, Tammy Moriello, Abe Simon. These aren't Hollywood extras pretending to be tough. These are men who know the waterfront because they've bled on it. The movie depicts what government investigators have been documenting for years. The Gambino crime family controls the New York side of the harbor, Brooklyn, Staten Island. The Genovese family controls New Jersey, Hoboken, Jersey City. Between them, they've carved up the most valuable waterfront in America. Joe Ryan, president of the ILA since 1927, is indicted in 1953. The charges: accepting payments from employers in exchange for labor peace. Ryan calls himself president for life. He's been running the union like a personal fiefdom for 26 years. The kickbacks, the loan sharking, the pilferage of union funds, none of it secret. All of it tolerated, until now. The same year Ryan falls, New York and New Jersey create something unprecedented. The Waterfront Commission, a bi-state agency with one mission: break the mob's grip on the docks. The commission bans public loaders, the gangs who claimed exclusive rights to load and unload trucks on specific piers, backed by ILA muscle. It establishes hiring halls to replace the shape-up. Starting in 1955, longshoremen no longer gather at a boss's feet hoping to be chosen. They badge in. They're assigned work by seniority, not bribery. The commission tracks hours, monitors hiring practices, investigates corruption. The ILA fights back with what investigators call terror tactics, vandalism, intimidation, threats against anyone who cooperates with the new system. But the commission holds. The hiring halls survive. For the first time in generations, a longshoreman can get work without paying tribute to someone connected to someone who answers to someone whose name appears in FBI files. Reform has arrived. The worst abuses of the waterfront are being cleaned up. The shape-up is dying. The hiring halls are bringing a measure of fairness to the docks. It feels like progress. It looks like progress. But none of it addresses the fundamental economics of break-bulk shipping. None of it changes the fact that loading cargo still costs $5.86 per ton. None of it alters the reality that 100 men still spend 1 week unloading a single ship. The Waterfront Commission cleaned up the corruption. It didn't touch the inefficiency. It reformed how men got hired. It didn't question whether those men would be needed at all. Because, while Hollywood was making movies and politicians were holding hearings, a trucking company owner from North Carolina was sitting in his cab on a Hoboken dock, watching stevedores unload cargo crate by crate, and thinking about a very different kind of revolution. A 24-year-old truck driver named Malcolm McLean sits in his cab at a dock in Hoboken, New Jersey. He's hauled cotton bales all the way from Fayetteville, North Carolina. Now he waits, and waits, and waits. In front of him, stevedores unload a freighter the same way stevedores have unloaded freighters for centuries. They lower a sling into the hold. They attach it to a crate. They hoist the crate out. They swing it onto the pier. They detach the sling. They lower it back into the hold. They do it again. 1 crate at a time, 1 barrel at a time, 1 bale at a time. McLean watches for hours. He's paying drivers by the hour. He's burning money watching other men work slowly. And he starts thinking about a question that will change the world. What if you didn't have to open the cargo at all? Malcolm McLean isn't a maritime man. He's never owned a ship, never run a port, never worked a day on the docks. He's a farm boy from Maxton, North Carolina, born in 1913, graduated high school during the Great Depression with no money for college. He pumped gas at a service station, saved $120, bought a used truck. By 1937, he's running a small fleet, hauling textiles and cigarettes up and down the East Coast. By the early 1950s, McLean Trucking is one of the largest trucking operations in the South. 1,700 trucks, 37 terminals. But he can't stop thinking about Hoboken. The ocean voyage isn't expensive. Fuel is cheap. Ships are efficient. The brutal cost is the human labor at both ends. The loading, the unloading, the handling, the waiting. Ships spend more time in port than at sea. That's where the money disappears. What if you could just lift the entire truck trailer onto the ship? What if you sealed the cargo at the factory and never touched it again until it reached the customer? McLean starts planning. He hires an engineer named Keith Tandlinger to design a standardized container and the fittings to secure it. He buys a World War II tanker called the Potrero Hills and converts it to carry containers on deck. He renames it the Ideal X. There's a problem. Federal regulations prohibit the same company from operating both trucks and ships. The Interstate Commerce Commission won't bend. So McLean makes a choice that his friends think is insane. He sells McLean Trucking, the company he built from a single used truck, and bets everything on an idea that the entire maritime industry thinks is ridiculous. April 26, 1956. Port Newark, New Jersey. 100 invited dignitaries gather to watch something unprecedented. A crane lifts 58 aluminum containers onto the deck of the Ideal X, not crates inside a hold, not barrels stacked by Longshoreman. Sealed metal boxes, 35 feet long, loaded in less than 8 hours. 5 days later, the Ideal X docks in Houston. Trucks are waiting. The containers come off. They're hitched to chassis and driven away. No stevedores descending into holds. No cargo nets swinging. No week-long unloading marathon. Loading cost for the Ideal X, 16 cents per ton. Loading cost for a conventional ship, $5.86 per ton. A 36-fold reduction in one voyage. As the Ideal X pulls away from Port Newark, a man stands on the dock watching. Freddie Fields, top official of the International Longshoremen's Association. Someone asks what he thinks of the new container ship. His answer, "I'd like to sink that son of a bitch." Fields understands what he's seeing. He understands it immediately. That ship isn't carrying cotton or coffee or machinery. It's carrying extinction. Every container that comes off that deck is a dozen longshoremen who won't be needed. 100 voyages and the shape-up becomes a ghost. 1,000 voyages and the waterfront dies. But Malcolm McLean doesn't care about Freddie Fields. He doesn't care about the ILA. He doesn't care about tradition or territory, or the 35,000 men who make their living loading cargo by hand. He cares about efficiency, and efficiency has just rendered 3,000 years of maritime labor practice obsolete. The only question now is where the containers will go, and the answer to that question will destroy New York's waterfront forever. The container didn't care about tradition. It didn't care about history. It didn't care that Manhattan's piers had handled cargo since Peter Stuyvesant built the first wharf in 1648. It cared about one thing only: space. A container ship doesn't work like a conventional freighter. You don't lower men into a hold to attach slings to individual crates. You lift 40-foot steel boxes off the deck with massive gantry cranes. You stack them on the pier 5 containers high. You load them onto truck chassis or railroad flat cars. You need room for the cranes to operate, room for the containers to stack, room for hundreds of trucks to line up, load, and depart. Manhattan has no room. The piers along the Hudson and East Rivers were built in the 19th century for a 19th century system. Horse-drawn wagons, hand labor, ships small enough to maneuver in tight spaces. The Finger Piers jutting into the water are long and narrow, perfect for break-bulk cargo handled piece by piece, worthless for containers that need to be staged in massive yards. Behind the piers, the city presses in. Warehouses, tenements, factories, streets so narrow and congested that a single truck takes an hour to travel 10 blocks. There's nowhere to put a container yard, nowhere to build rail connections, nowhere to stage the hundreds of vehicles that containerization demands. And there's another problem. Of the 12 major railroad lines serving the port of New York, only 2 reach Manhattan directly. The rest terminate on the New Jersey shore of the Hudson River. For generations, cargo has moved between New Jersey rail yards and Manhattan piers by lighter, small boats ferrying goods across the water. It's slow. It's expensive. It works for break-bulk shipping, because everything about break-bulk shipping is slow and expensive. Containerization changes the math. The whole point is speed, seamless transfer from ship to truck to train. Every delay costs money. Every extra handling step destroys the efficiency gains. The lighterage system that served Manhattan for a century becomes an anchor dragging the port backward. Brooklyn offers more space than Manhattan, but not enough. The Brooklyn-Queens Expressway, completed in 1957, cuts the waterfront neighborhoods off from the rest of the borough. Red Hook, once one of the busiest port areas in America, finds itself isolated. The Port Authority spends millions upgrading Brooklyn facilities, replacing 27 obsolete piers with 12 modern ones. It's not nearly sufficient. The roads are congested, the rail access is limited, the container yards are too small. Meanwhile, 19 miles west, there's nothing but marshland, Newark Bay, tidal flats and wetlands stretching for miles. No factories, no tenements, no century of infrastructure to work around. Empty land that nobody has ever wanted for anything. Until now. New Jersey Governor Robert Maynor sees what New York's leaders refuse to acknowledge. The container revolution isn't coming. It's already here. And whoever builds the facilities to handle it will own the future of East Coast shipping. In 1955, Maynor launches the Port Elizabeth project, 450 acres of marshland, to be transformed into the largest port construction project in American history. Deep water channels dredged into the bay, direct connections to the New Jersey Turnpike, direct rail access to the national freight network, flat open land stretching to the horizon, waiting to be covered in containers. The Port Authority of New York and New Jersey oversees construction, the same agency that operates the bridges and tunnels and airports serving both states. They know the numbers. They know where the future lies. And the future lies in New Jersey. August 15th, 1962. The Elizabeth Marine Terminal opens, the world's first dedicated container port. 90 acres devoted to Malcolm McLean's Sealand operation. Cranes capable of lifting containers directly from ship to truck. Staging areas for thousands of steel boxes. A prototype that every container terminal on Earth will eventually copy. The numbers shift immediately. Port Elizabeth's share of regional cargo tonnage doubles from 9% to 18% between 1956 and 1960. By 1970, New Jersey ports capture 63% of the region's general cargo. 63%. Two-thirds of all cargo that once flowed through Manhattan and Brooklyn now moves through facilities that didn't exist 15 years earlier. Shipping lines don't care about sentiment. They don't care that New York built the Erie Canal or welcomed the Titanic survivors or processed millions of immigrants through its harbor. They care about cost, speed, efficiency, and New Jersey offers all three, while New York offers traffic jams, narrow streets, and piers designed for wooden sailing ships. The city that controlled American commerce for 150 years watches its empire sail across the harbor. Every container that lands in Elizabeth is a container that doesn't land in Brooklyn. Every truck that loads in Newark is a truck that doesn't load in Manhattan. The transfer happens with stunning speed. Within a decade, the geography of the port has inverted completely. By the early 1980s, almost all maritime cargo transshipment in Manhattan has ceased. The great piers stand empty. The warehouses fall silent. But the cruelest cut isn't the lost cargo. It's the lost men. Because every container that replaces 100 crates also replaces the 100 longshoremen who would have moved them. Here is the arithmetic of extinction. Before containerization, a medium-sized freighter requires 100 longshoremen working around the clock for 7 days to unload. 100 men. 1 week. That's the math that has governed waterfront labor since the Phoenicians. After containerization, the same cargo moves in less than a day. 6 to 8 workers operating cranes and driving trucks. No men descending into holes. No slings. No hooks. No gangs. Same cargo. 90% fewer workers. The International Longshoremen's Association sees it coming the moment the Ideal X leaves Port Newark. Thomas Gleason, who will become ILA president in 1963, puts it bluntly. The container is digging our graves and we cannot live off containers. He's right. And he's powerless to stop it. In the 1950s, the Port of New York employs approximately 35,000 longshoremen. 35,000 men who show up at the hiring halls, who load and unload ships, who support families in Red Hook and Hell's Kitchen and Hoboken. 35,000 paychecks flowing into neighborhoods built around the certainty that cargo will always need human hands. By the mid-1970s, that number is 3,500. 90% gone. Not over generations, not over decades. Within 15 years, the ILA fights back with the only weapons it has: strikes, work stoppages, political pressure. In 1968, longshoremen walk off the job for 57 days, the longest port strike in American history. They're not fighting for higher wages, they're fighting for survival. The union wins concessions. In 1964, the ILA negotiates a guaranteed annual income clause into its contracts. If containerization eliminates your job, you still get paid. The Port of New York guarantees longshoremen payment for 2,080 hours per year, 40 hours a week, 52 weeks a year, whether work exists or not. The money comes from a tonnage charge levied on all cargo crossing the docks. It sounds like victory. It's not. By the mid-1970s, senior longshoremen collect full salaries while doing almost nothing. Upside-down seniority rules mean the youngest workers handle what little manual labor remains. Veterans badge in, wait to see if they're needed, go home when they're not, and still receive their guaranteed pay. A 1977 Time magazine report finds that some older longshoremen never work at all. They've negotiated their way into paid obsolescence. But the guarantee only covers workers already in the system. The union freezes new membership. Sons who expected to follow fathers onto the docks find the door closed. The waterfront that employed generations of Irish and Italian families stops hiring. The jobs don't disappear gradually. They simply end. The union also wins a monopoly on handling containers within 50 miles of the dockside. Every box that gets packed or unpacked in that radius must be touched by ILA labor. It's a desperate attempt to preserve work that containerization was designed to eliminate. Shippers pay the premium. They pass it along to customers. It makes New York ports more expensive than competitors without saving a single job that the container has already destroyed. And here's the bitter irony. American cargo traffic doesn't decline after containerization. It explodes, soars 276%, more goods moving through American ports than ever before in history. The container revolution that destroys longshoremen jobs creates a global shipping boom beyond anything the old breakbulk system could have handled. The work doesn't disappear. It transforms. Crane operators replace hookmen. Truck drivers replace stevedores. Computer systems replace clipboard-wielding checkers. The jobs move from the pier to the inland distribution center, from the waterfront to the highway. But they don't stay in the neighborhoods that needed them. Red Hook hollows out. The coffee roasting mills that once scented the Brooklyn waterfront close. Warehouses shutter. Bars that served longshoremen after the morning shift find no one to serve. Entire communities built around the shape-up discover that their reason to exist has sailed to New Jersey. By 1971, every shipping company except the Red Hook Container Terminal has abandoned New York for Port Newark and Port Elizabeth. The few remaining operations limp along on declining cargo and aging workers. In 1983, the Brooklyn Marine Terminal, the last significant cargo facility on the Brooklyn waterfront, closes permanently. ILA membership tells the story in cold numbers. 40,000 members in the mid-1950s, 19,962 in 1970, 11,000 by the end of that decade. The most powerful waterfront union in America shrinks by 3/4 in a single generation. The longshoremen aren't the only casualties. They're just the most visible. Because the port wasn't only a place where ships docked and cargo moved. It was the foundation of an entire manufacturing economy. And when the port died, it took that economy with it. The port didn't die alone. When cargo stops flowing through a city, everything connected to that cargo begins to suffocate. The warehouses that stored goods before distribution, the factories that processed raw materials arriving by ship, the trucking companies that hauled freight from pier to rail yard, the machine shops that repaired dock equipment, the rope makers and sail makers and ship chandlers who had served the maritime trade for generations. All of it gone. Between 1969 and 1976, New York City loses an average of 1,000 industrial firms per year. 1,000 companies shuttered, relocated, bankrupt every single year for 7 consecutive years. The numbers are staggering. 500,000 manufacturing jobs disappear from the city in that same period. 500,000 paychecks. The industrial workforce that peaked at just over 1 million workers after World War II, the men and women who made New York the manufacturing capital of the Western Hemisphere, is cut in half. Unemployment climbs to 10%. 1 in 10 New Yorkers looking for work and finding nothing. The waterfront collapse isn't the only cause. Containerization is part of a larger economic shift that decimates American manufacturing everywhere. Competition from Japan and Germany, rising labor costs, the migration of factories to the Sun Belt and then overseas. New York suffers from the same forces battering Detroit and Cleveland and Pittsburgh. But the waterfront makes it worse, much worse. Because New York's manufacturing economy was built on the assumption that raw materials would arrive by ship and finished goods would depart the same way. Factories clustered near the piers, suppliers located within trucking distance of the docks. The whole industrial geography of the city oriented itself around a port that no longer functions. When the cargo moves to New Jersey, the factories have a choice: relocate closer to the new port, or pay higher transportation costs to ship materials across the harbor, or close most close. The garment district, once the heart of American fashion manufacturing, begins its long contraction. The printing plants that made New York the publishing capital of the world start moving to cheaper locations. The food processing facilities that turned imported cocoa and coffee and sugar into consumer products find they can operate more efficiently elsewhere. Industry after industry discovers that the advantages of a New York location have evaporated along with the port that created them. With the factories go the tax revenues, and with the tax revenues goes the city's ability to function. By 1975, New York City is running annual deficits approaching $500 million. The city has been borrowing to cover operating expenses for years, a budgetary shell game that works only as long as investors keep buying municipal bonds. In the spring of 1975, they stop. The banks look at the city's revenue projections and decide they will no longer underwrite New York's debt. The city runs out of money. Mayor Abraham Beame pleads with Albany. Governor Hugh Carey pleads with Washington. President Gerald Ford refuses. On October 29, 1975, Ford delivers a speech rejecting federal loan guarantees for New York City. The next morning, the Daily News prints the most famous headline in its history: Ford to City, drop dead. Ford never actually says those words, but the message is clear enough. New York created its own problems. New York can solve them alone. On October 17, 1975, the city comes within hours of default. Lawyers draft a bankruptcy petition. The statement is ready for release. The city of New York is unable to pay its debts or obligations as they mature. At the last moment, Albert Shanker, president of the United Federation of Teachers, agrees to invest $150 million from the union's pension fund in city bonds. The default is averted. Barely. The cuts that follow are savage. The city fires 40,000 employees: police, firefighters, teachers, sanitation workers. Services that New Yorkers have relied upon for decades simply disappear. Subway trains run less frequently. Garbage piles up. Response times lengthen. The city that handled 33% of America's seaborne trade cannot afford to pick up its own trash. Ford eventually relents. In December 1975, he signs legislation providing $2.3 billion in short-term loans. It's not a bailout. It's a lifeline attached to conditions that require the city to balance its budget through further cuts and tax increases. The bleeding slows, it doesn't stop, and the physical decay spreads like infection. The South Bronx becomes the symbol of urban collapse. Between 1970 and 1980, 7 census tracts lose more than 97% of their buildings to fire and abandonment. 97%. 44 additional tracts lose more than half their structures. Landlords, unable to sell properties at any price, begin burning them for insurance money. Firefighters respond to as many as 7 fully involved structure fires in a single shift. There aren't enough trucks. There aren't enough men. The firehouses have been closed to save money. On October 5, 1977, President Jimmy Carter visits Charlotte Street in the South Bronx. The street is so devastated, it has been removed from official city maps. Vacant lots stretch in every direction. Burned-out shells of apartment buildings stand like broken teeth. Carter promises federal help. Journalists compare the landscape to Dresden after the Allied bombing. 60 million Americans watched the 1977 World Series. During Game 2, ABC cuts to a helicopter shot outside Yankee Stadium. A massive fire burns in an abandoned building. The Bronx is burning, and the whole country can see it. New York City loses nearly 1 million residents during the 1970s. 1 million people who decide the city has nothing left to offer them. They flee to the suburbs, to the Sun Belt, to anywhere that isn't collapsing around them. The city that built itself on the waterfront discovers what happens when the waterfront dies. Everything dies with it. But not forever. Because even as the old New York crumbles, a new vision begins to emerge. One that sees the abandoned piers not as symbols of failure, but as opportunities for transformation. On December 15, 1973, a dump truck carrying asphalt for repairs rumbles across the West Side elevated highway near Gansevoort Street. The pavement gives way. The truck and a passenger car plunge through the deck. The highway has been dying for years. Maintenance deferred. Salt corrosion eating through steel. Chunks of facade falling onto the streets below. The collapse simply makes the decay impossible to ignore. Officials close the elevated structure. Traffic backs up for miles. And a debate begins that will shape the future of Manhattan's waterfront for the next half-century. The obvious solution is Westway, a $2.4 billion project to replace the crumbling highway with a 6-lane interstate buried beneath 220 acres of new landfill extending into the Hudson River. The plan offers everything New York supposedly needs: modern infrastructure, commercial development, and 98 acres of parkland built atop the underground roadway. Presidents support it. Senators champion it. Governors and mayors who campaigned against it change their minds once elected and embrace it enthusiastically. The construction unions want the jobs. The real estate industry wants the development rights. The banks want to finance the whole thing. From 1971 to 1985, Westway represents the combined will of nearly every powerful institution in New York. It never gets built. A small coalition of citizen activists, environmental lawyers, and neighborhood organizers decides to fight. They are outmatched in every conceivable way. The project's backers have billions of dollars, political connections at every level of government, and the presumption that progress means building big. The opponents have the Clean Water Act. In 1982, Judge Thomas Grieser of the U.S. District Court blocks the Army Corps of Engineers permit for Westway. The reason? Striped base. Government scientists discover that the section of Hudson River to be filled provides critical habitat for the fish. The Corps claims the base can simply relocate elsewhere, but their testimony is confused, contradictory, wobbly. The court finds that the environmental review was fundamentally flawed. Appeals fail. The Reagan administration pushes forward anyway. The Corps grants a new permit. Opponents sue again. The House of Representatives votes 2-1 against funding the project. Congressional conservatives who might have supported highway construction balk at the cost. On September 19, 1985, Governor Mario Cuomo and Mayor Ed Koch surrender. After more than 12 years of effort, Westway is dead. The most expensive highway project ever proposed in America, backed by presidents and senators and the entire business establishment of New York, is killed by citizens armed with environmental law and a fish. The striped base save the waterfront. What rises in Westway's place is something its supporters never imagined and its opponents barely dared to hope for. Not a highway buried beneath landfill, but public parks stretching the length of Manhattan's western shore. The transformation takes decades. The abandoned elevated highway isn't fully demolished until 1989. A replacement surface road, modest, practical, nothing like the grand interstate Westway promised, takes until 2001 to complete. The real work happens alongside and after. In June 1998, the New York State Legislature passes the Hudson River Park Act. Governor George Pataki signs it in September. The legislation combines state-owned land from Battery Park to 35th Street with city-owned land from 35th Street to 59th Street, creating a single entity to plan, build, and operate a new waterfront park. Mayor Rudolph Giuliani and Governor Pataki commit $200 million in state and city funds. The scale is staggering. 550 acres, 4.5 miles of continuous public waterfront. The largest park construction project in Manhattan since Central Park opened more than a century earlier. By the 1980s, the Hudson River waterfront had become a derelict landscape of barbed wire, crumbling piers, parking lots, and decaying warehouses. The maritime commerce that built these facilities has vanished. The infrastructure rots. For decades, New Yorkers have been cut off from the river that once defined their city. The Hudson River Park Trust begins reversing that severance piece by piece. The first complete section opens in Greenwich Village in 2003. Chelsea Piers, a sports and entertainment complex, has already been operating since 1995. New segments follow throughout the 2000s and 2010s. Recreational piers, playgrounds, kayak launches, a 5-mile bike and running path that becomes the busiest bikeway in America. The park now attracts 17 million visitors annually. 17 million people walking, running, cycling and playing along a waterfront that 40 years earlier was a wasteland of abandoned shipping infrastructure. Brooklyn follows a parallel path. The Port Authority announces plans to sell the defunct Brooklyn piers for commercial development in 1983. Local residents, led by the Brooklyn Heights Association and what becomes the Brooklyn Bridge Park Coalition, begin a 20-year campaign to transform the waterfront into public space instead. The obstacles are immense. The Port Authority wants revenue. Developers see profit in the spectacular Manhattan views. Politicians waffle, but the coalition persists, building public support, fighting legal battles, demanding that the community's interests take precedence over private gain. In 2002, Governor Pataki and Mayor Michael Bloomberg sign an agreement dedicating state and city funding for Brooklyn Bridge Park. The landscape architecture firm Michael Van Valkenburg Associates develops a master plan. Construction begins in 2008. In March 2010, the first 6 acres open at Pier 1. By 2015, the 85-acre park is substantially complete. Playgrounds and sports courts replace cargo cranes. Salt marshes and meadows grow where warehouses once stored goods bound for destinations around the world. The industrial waterfront that fell silent when containers migrated to New Jersey becomes one of the most celebrated public spaces in America. 5 million visitors arrive each year. Families picnic on lawns overlooking the Manhattan skyline. Children play in the shadow of the Brooklyn Bridge. The piers that once processed cargo from every ocean now host kayakers, volleyball players, and tourists photographing a view that belongs to everyone. The transformation is not without irony. The environmental regulations that killed Westway, designed to protect fish habitat from development, help create parks that return New Yorkers to the water's edge for the first time in generations. The striped bass that swam in the Hudson during the Maritime era now swim beneath piers rebuilt for recreation rather than commerce. The silent waterfront finds its voice again, not in the rumble of cargo trucks or the shouts of longshoremen, but in the laughter of children and the conversations of neighbors enjoying a resource their grandparents never could. But the cargo didn't disappear. It simply moved. And 19 miles away, across the harbor in New Jersey, the container revolution that destroyed New York's maritime empire continues building something the old longshoremen would barely recognize. The container didn't just destroy New York's waterfront. It built an empire across the harbor. Port Newark Elizabeth Marine Terminal sprawls across more than 2,000 acres of what was once tidal marshland on the western shore of Newark Bay. 5 modern container terminals, massive gantry cranes capable of handling vessels 23 containers wide, direct connections to the New Jersey Turnpike, Interstate 78, and rail lines reaching into the American heartland. The infrastructure Malcolm McLean dreamed of when he watched stevedores unload cargo crate by crate in 1937 made manifest on an almost unimaginable scale. In 2024, the Port of New York and New Jersey handles 8.7 million 20-foot equivalent units. That's TEUs, the standard measure of container shipping, named for the 20-foot steel boxes that revolutionize global trade, an 11% increase over the previous year. The third busiest container port in the United States, trailing only Los Angeles and Long Beach, the largest on the entire East Coast. The numbers would have seemed impossible to the longshoreman who watched the Ideal X depart Port Newark in 1956. 8 million containers, each one carrying cargo that would have taken 100 men a week to handle using the old methods. And yet the work continues. Different work. Transformed work. But work nonetheless. Modern longshoremen don't descend into cargo holds with hooks and slings. They operate ship-to-shore cranes from climate-controlled cabs positioned 200 feet in the air. They drive straddle carriers, massive wheeled machines that lift containers from the ground and transport them across the terminal yard. They manage sophisticated computer systems that track every box from arrival to departure. The APM terminal in Elizabeth alone processes over 2.3 million TEUs annually across 350 acres of concrete and steel. 14 ship-to-shore cranes with outreach extending across the widest vessels afloat. 24 inbound gates and 16 outbound gates processing more than 5,000 truck transactions every day. Truck turn times averaging just 50 minutes from arrival to departure. The efficiency Malcolm McLean envisioned has been achieved and exceeded beyond anything he could have imagined. What once cost $5.86 per ton to load now happens so fast and so cheaply that the cost barely registers against the value of the cargo. Ships that spent more time in port than at sea now arrive, discharge thousands of containers, reload, and depart within hours. But efficiency comes at a price, and the longshoremen who remain understand exactly what that price has been and what it could become. On October 1st, 2024, at 12:01 a.m., 47,000 members of the International Longshoremen's Association walk off the job at 36 ports from Maine to Texas. It is the first coast-wide ILA strike since 1977. The issues are wages and automation, especially automation. ILA President Harold Daggett stands on the picket line outside APM Terminal in Elizabeth and delivers a message that echoes across 7 decades. The union wants a $5 per hour wage increase for each year of a new 6-year contract. But more than money, the ILA demands what Daggett calls absolute airtight language, prohibiting automation or semi-automation. The fear is existential. Radio frequency identification systems track trucks entering terminals without human checkers. Automated gates process credentials that clerks once verified by hand. Software manages container movements that coordinators once directed in person. Each innovation eliminates jobs. Each efficiency gain shrinks the workforce. If we don't put our foot down now, Daggett tells reporters, they would like to run over us. The union carries signs reading, "Machines don't feed families." The phrase captures something the ILA has understood since Freddie Fields watched the Ideal X depart and said he'd like to sink it. Technology doesn't negotiate. It doesn't care about tradition or history or the communities built around the certainty of work. It simply makes human labor unnecessary, one innovation at a time. The strike lasts 3 days. Billions in trade stops moving. Bananas rot in holes. Auto parts needed to keep American factories running sight offshore on anchored vessels. The Biden administration intervenes. Acting Labor Secretary Julie Su brokers a tentative agreement, a 62% wage increase over 6 years, bringing top pay from $39 to $63 per hour. But the automation language remains unresolved. The contract extension pushes the deadline to January 2025. The fundamental conflict, human labor versus machine efficiency, continues. History does not repeat, but it rhymes. In the 1960s, the ILA negotiated guaranteed annual income provisions that protected existing workers while freezing new hiring. The union won battles against the container and lost the war. Jobs moved to New Jersey anyway. The waterfront that employed 35,000 longshoremen in the 1950s employs a fraction of that today. The modern ILA faces the same impossible arithmetic. Container volume keeps growing. Port activity keeps increasing. But automation means that growth doesn't translate into proportional employment. Cranes that once required operators may soon pilot themselves. Gates that need checkers today may run on artificial intelligence tomorrow. The same technological forces that destroyed Manhattan's waterfront continue advancing. Some longshoremen still earn over $200,000 annually, but only by logging enormous overtime hours, sometimes approaching 100 per week. A more typical salary exceeds $100,000. These are good jobs, union jobs, jobs that support families and communities, jobs worth fighting to protect. The Waterfront Commission of New York Harbor reports that approximately 1/3 of local longshoremen earn $200,000 or more per year. The work is demanding. The hours are brutal. But for those who have it, the work represents exactly what the old waterfront once provided: a path to middle-class stability for workers without college degrees. Port Newark Elizabeth processes furniture, machinery, vehicles, beverages, electronics, and plastics arriving from China, India, Italy, Germany, and France. It exports medical instruments, aircraft parts, computers, jewelry, and scrap metal to destinations around the world. Trucks departing the terminal can reach 44 million people within 4 hours. The infrastructure connects to rail lines serving Canada and the Midwest. More cargo moves through this facility than the old Port of New York ever handled in its peak years. The container revolution succeeded beyond Malcolm McLean's wildest dreams. Global trade exploded, shipping costs collapsed, goods that once seemed exotic became everyday commodities available in every American store. The world shrank. Commerce expanded. Prosperity, measured in cheap consumer goods and efficient supply chains, multiplied. But prosperity measured in stable employment and thriving waterfront communities, that calculation tells a different story. The ILA members who walked picket lines in October 2024 understand something their predecessors learned the hard way. The container doesn't care about history. It doesn't care about families. It only cares about efficiency. And efficiency, left unchecked, will always choose the machine over the worker. 68 years after Malcolm McLean's aluminum boxes first crossed Newark Bay, the battle continues. The stakes haven't changed. Only the weapons have evolved. And somewhere beneath the cranes and containers, the ghosts of 35,000 longshoremen watch and wait to see how the story ends. Hudson River Park, Pier 54. If you stand here at sunset, looking west across the water toward New Jersey, you're standing on history. This is where the Carpathia docked in 1912, carrying the survivors of the Titanic. This is where the Lusitania departed in 1915 before a German torpedo sent her to the bottom. This is where troop ships sailed for Europe in 2 world wars, where ocean liners brought millions of immigrants to the promised land, where longshoremen worked themselves to exhaustion moving the cargo that built the greatest city on earth. Today, there's a floating park here. Tulip-shaped concrete pots supporting an undulating landscape called Little Island. Tourists take selfies, families spread picnic blankets, musicians perform in a 687-seat amphitheater with views of the Hudson. It's beautiful, it's peaceful, and it's built on the bones of an empire that refused to change. Lesson 1. Technology doesn't negotiate. The container didn't care about tradition. It didn't respect the generations of longshoremen who'd built their lives around break bulk shipping. It didn't care about union contracts, political connections, or the power of the ILA. It simply worked better, cheaper, faster. Freddie Fields watched the Ideal X sail from Port Newark in 1956 and said he wanted to sink it. Thomas Gleason led strikes against containerization through the 1960s. The union won guaranteed annual income, work preservation clauses, a monopoly on container handling within 50 miles of the docks. They won every battle, and they lost the war. Because you can't strike against efficiency. You can't negotiate with mathematics. When loading costs drop from $5.86 per ton to 16 cents per ton, no amount of political power can reverse the outcome. The container was coming whether anyone wanted it or not. The only question was who would adapt and who would be destroyed. Lesson 2. Geography is destiny until it isn't. For 300 years, New York's natural harbor was its greatest asset. The Erie Canal, the railroad terminals, the lighterage system. Everything was built around the assumption that Manhattan's waterfront was the center of American commerce forever. Then the container changed the rules. Suddenly, what mattered wasn't deep water or protected harbors. What mattered was flat land, highway access, rail connections, room to stack thousands of 40-foot steel boxes. Manhattan had none of it. Brooklyn had a little. New Jersey had everything. The marshlands around Newark Bay, worthless real estate for 300 years, became the most valuable port property on the eastern seaboard. The piers where the Queen Mary docked became parking lots. The city that controlled the harbor for 3 centuries watched its maritime empire sail 19 miles west and never come back. Geography made New York, technology unmade it, and the city's leaders, too confident in their natural advantages, never saw it coming until it was too late. Lesson 3. Protecting jobs isn't the same as protecting workers. The ILA fought for decades to preserve longshoreman jobs. They won guaranteed income for workers displaced by automation. They won rules requiring extra crews, extra handling, extra labor at every step. They made containerized shipping in New York more expensive than it needed to be. And they saved no one. Because while the union was protecting jobs on the New York waterfront, the jobs were moving to New Jersey. While the union was fighting automation at the docks, the factories that depended on those docks were leaving the city entirely. The longshoremen who kept their positions collected their guaranteed income while their sons and daughters moved to the suburbs to find work. Between 1967 and 1976, New York lost 1/3 of its manufacturing jobs. Not just dock work, all the industries that existed because the port existed. The union's victory was Pyrrhic. They protected yesterday's jobs while tomorrow's economy moved somewhere else. What remains? The Port of New York didn't die. It transformed. Port Newark Elizabeth handles more cargo today than the old port ever did in its peak years. The container revolution that killed New York's waterfront built one of the most sophisticated logistics operations on the planet, just 19 miles west of Manhattan. Meanwhile, the silent piers of Manhattan and Brooklyn have become something their builders never imagined. Public parks. Hudson River Park draws 17 million visitors a year. Brooklyn Bridge Park occupies the site where the last cargo terminal closed in 1983. The waterfront that once served commerce now serves community. Where longshoremen once worked, families now play. It's a remarkable transformation, a second life for infrastructure that seemed destined for permanent decay. But it's also a monument to failure, to the decades when New York's leaders couldn't imagine a future without break-bulk shipping, couldn't find a way to compete with Port Elizabeth, couldn't adapt quickly enough to save the industries that made the city great. The silent piers speak. Walk along the Hudson River Greenway today, the busiest bike path in America. Look at the steel skeletons of the old pier sheds, preserved as reminders of what used to be. Read the historical markers describing ships that no longer call and cargoes that no longer arrive. Listen to what they're telling you. They're telling you that no industry is permanent, that no geographic advantage lasts forever, that the technologies and systems that build empires can destroy them just as quickly when something better comes along. They're telling you that fighting change doesn't stop change. It just determines whether you'll be its victim or its beneficiary. They're telling you that the cities, companies, and workers who thrive are the ones who see the future coming and move toward it, not the ones who cling to the past until the past abandons them. Malcolm McLean was a trucking company owner who knew nothing about maritime shipping. He looked at the inefficiency of loading cargo and asked a simple question: what if we did this differently? That question destroyed an empire and built a new one. The ILA was the most powerful labor union on the waterfront. They had political connections, economic leverage, and 35,000 members willing to strike. They asked a different question: how do we keep things the way they are? That question led to a 90% reduction in their workforce. The silent piers of Manhattan aren't just real estate, they're a warning to every industry that believes its current structure is permanent, to every union that believes it can negotiate its way out of technological disruption, to every city that believes its geographic advantages will last forever. Adapt or die. The Port of New York chose to fight the future, and now, where ships once docked and longshoremen once worked, there's only silence and the distant sound of container cranes operating across the harbor in New Jersey, loading the ships that never come to Manhattan anymore. The waterfront that built America's greatest city sits quiet now. The machines are gone. The workers are gone. The ships are gone. All that's left is the lesson, and if you listen close enough, the silent piers are screaming it. Subscribe so you don't miss our next story, because what happened to New York's waterfront is happening right now to industries you depend on. The only question is whether anyone's paying attention.